So our first question today is, what are stored procedures? Hi everyone, we're here today with Sabrish for another SQL mock interview. For those of you who aren't already familiar with Exponent, Exponent helps you get your dream tech career with our online courses, expert coaching, peer-to-peer mock interviewing platform, and interview question database. Check it out at tryexponent.com. All right, so let's get right into it then. So our first question today is, what are stored procedures?
Yeah, great, interesting question. I mean, you could get this question in any of the standard SQL interviews that you would participate. So to begin with, I would say stored procedures are nothing but subroutines or a group of SQL statements that are stored together in a database. So these group of SQL statements can accept some parameters and perform some SQL operations. And based upon the SQL statements in the procedure and the parameters you pass, it can perform one or more DML operations, that is data manipulation language operations. And the good thing is it can return value. So when I say value, the stored procedure can return one value, it can return one data set, or it can return multiple data sets. So that's the beauty of the stored procedure. It can return values depending upon the business requirement. Now I would like to talk about the types of stored procedures. So basically there are two types of stored procedures. One is the system-defined stored procedures. So when you install SQL Server Management Studio within your system, so by default, a certain set of stored procedures are made available to you. So these are called as system-defined stored procedure. So as a developer, you don't deal with these type of stored procedures because you don't develop it or you don't have any control over them. They are system-defined and they basically start with the name SP underscore. That's one point, like whenever you create a stored procedure, don't give a name called as SP underscore. And the second one is the user defined stored procedures. That is the one which a developer or a database administrator will usually create. And it can have a bunch of SQL statements that give a specific information or do some data manipulation language like operations like updates or inserts. Yeah, so that's what a high level description of what stored procedures are and what it contains and the different types of stored procedures.
Cool. Okay. Can you give us an example of like each type of stored procedure, like both the system defined and the user ones that you just mentioned?
Yeah, so the user one could be anything that the application wants. So let's say I'm creating a system for HRMS or human resource management system. So in human resource management system, the HR goes on and schedules an interview between a candidate as well as the interviewer. Yeah. So let's say from the user interface perspective, there is a screen which gives a list of all the candidates that are scheduled for interview today. So to get those interview details, so I can write a stored procedure which can give out all the details about the interview. For example, the candidate name, the job he has applied for, and the interview timestamp, that is the date and time when the interview is scheduled. So I can get all this information when I write a stored procedure. So, and that stored procedure will contain a SQL statement which gives out all this information from the database table. Okay. So that's an example of the user-defined stored procedure. And when I talk about system-defined stored procedures, so that's the one which SQL usually creates by themselves. So we don't need to worry about like what's actually happening inside them. So as a developer, I don't deal with them regularly. But yeah, for DBAs or someone who are working, that is database administrators who work on those areas, they basically deal with them for some security related aspects or some of the aspects which gives information about database statistics. So those are the inbuilt ones, which as a developer, we won't deal with regularly, but yeah, as a database administrator, they usually deal with them.
Cool. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So then what are some of the benefits of using these stored procedures?
Yeah, there are like plenty of benefits. I can talk about it for a whole day, but I just want to focus on the core points. So I would like to answer this in 5 simple points. So there are 5 key benefits of using stored procedures. So the main thing would be reduced server or client network traffic. So for example, the commands in the stored procedure are executed as a single batch of code. So this can significantly reduce the network traffic between the server and the client because only the call to execute the procedure is sent across the network. Let's just imagine without the code encapsulation provided by the procedure, every individual line of code would have to cross the network. So this is one of the key advantages that a stored procedure has to offer. And next is security. So from a security standpoint, so whenever we call a stored procedure over the network, the only thing that gets exposed is the name of the stored procedure. Therefore, the hackers or malicious users cannot see the table and the database object names. So they cannot search for any critical data. Also, the stored procedure guards against the SQL injection attack. So since parameters are treated as a literal value and not an executable code, it is difficult for an attacker to insert a command into the TSQL statements inside the stored procedure and compromise security. And next key aspect is the reusability of code. So for example, if there are any repeated database operation that you have to use from an application standpoint, so you can encapsulate that code into a stored procedure and use that stored procedure wherever it is necessary. So this allows to increase the code consistency and allows the code to be accessed and executed by any of the user. And next key advantage would be the maintenance. So when the client applications call the stored procedures and keep database operations in the data tier, only the procedures must be updated for any changes in the underlying database. So the application tier remains separate and does not have to know about any changes to the database layouts, relationships, or processes. And the last and the key advantage is the improved performance. So by default, a procedure compiles the first time, it is executed, and it creates an execution plan. So whenever the next time the same procedure executes, so the execution plan is already in place, and it takes typically less time to process the stored procedure. So these are the 5 key advantages that I see, like for the benefits of using the stored procedures than the standard SQL queries.
Okay, great. Yeah, I really like that your answer covered like multiple different aspects of software engineering, from like encapsulation and modularity to security and performance. It seems like there really are a lot of advantages to using stored procedures. So as such, I'd love to see you actually demonstrate this. Can you show us like what the syntax of a stored procedure is like?
Oh yeah, sure. I would be happy to share that with you. So let me just quickly share my screen and let me bring my SSMS editor. So can you see my screen, Angelica?
Yes.
Yeah, so before explaining about what a stored procedure is and how it can be written, so I'm just going to give you a brief overview about 4 standard tables out of which we are going to derive the stored procedure. So as you can see, like I'm going to explain this in terms of a typical human resource management system or HRMS system. So we have 4 tables here, that is ASP.NET users, the first one. So this maintains information about all the users in the system. I mean, all the users who are using the system. So it could be either the candidate who is using the system or the hiring manager, the interviewer, or the HR. So you have the user information of all these 4 users created within this table. And next is the job master table. So like the interview is being conducted for a specific role, right? It could be either a project manager, it could be a software developer, or it could be a product manager. But depending upon whichever roles you are interviewing the candidate for, so this table holds the master list of all the job roles. And next is the candidate details. And these are the candidates who have created a profile within the application and they have submitted their resume. So all the candidate information are stored within this table, candidate details. And next is the candidate interview schedule. So in this table, candidate interview schedule, we actually save the information regarding when a candidate is scheduled to give interview, who is the interviewer, and the timestamp of when the interview is scheduled. So all the key information about the interview is stored within this candidate interview schedule table. So these are the 4 tables that we're going to deal with at this stage. So now let's say as an interviewer, I want to get a list of all the interviews scheduled. So I can do this by simply writing a stored procedure. So the basic syntax is, I just say create procedure, and you can give any user defined name. So as a general standard, I prefer using the keyword USP, and let's say get interviewers list. So this is the create procedure, and then we write an as keyword, begin, end. So this is the structure of a standard stored procedure. Now herein, I'm just going to paste the query of the requirement that I just discussed. So here I'm trying to get the list of all the interviewers, interviewee, the job that the candidate is being interviewed for from the table candidate interview details. So this table candidate interview details, I'm just going to do a select star. So you can see that it has information about the candidate ID, the job ID, as well as interviewer ID. So to get this information, we have to join it with the specific tables which gives out these details. For example, job master has the meaning of this job ID 6, and candidate ID, like what is the candidate name? So that's in a different table, and the interviewer ID is in the user table. So that's the reason why we do a join with these tables to get out the information. get this information. So for example, we write these queries in the select statement, and so that's it. So I just need to select this and then say execute. So at this stage, I have this stored procedure created. So now I would like to see the results, right? So to do that, I just say exec and the name of the procedure that I just created. So once I execute this line of code, I'm going to get the results. So here you can see the candidate is Edwin Donnelly and the interviewer is Jason, and he's being interviewed for the role of project manager. And this is the interview timestamp. So 13th of August, and his interview is scheduled at 4:30 p.m. So this gives me a list of all the interviewers, candidates, job, as well as the timestamp. So this is the basic definition or how a basic stored procedure would look like.
Yeah, that sounds really useful because that seems like a very frequently used query in a system like this.
Yeah.
Okay, so just little SQL question here then, just so we can get a better idea of what this query is actually doing. So what happens then if let's say for one of the job candidates, the candidate ID is missing from the candidate details table?
So ideally, the candidate ID wouldn't be missing because that is the primary key of the application. So that's an auto-generated ID or the key that gets inserted into every table. So that is a primary key, and the system should have that details. I mean, every candidate has to have that ID, and that's something which we did not worry about. So the program is tuned in such a way that whenever a new candidate is created, so an identity column or a key is created, and it gives a value by default, so that no two candidates get the same value. So let's say if I insert a value of 1 into the first row, the next row automatically gets a value of 2. So it doesn't violate the primary key constraint, and the number is automatically incremented by 1.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. Okay. So I would love to hear a little bit more then, for stored procedures, can there be different types of parameters, and what types of parameters are there?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, as per my knowledge, stored procedure can have 3 types of parameters. So first is the input parameters. So the input parameters are the default parameters that you specify. So let's say against any parameter, if I don't give any keyword, so the stored procedure treats them as a default parameter. So by using this input parameter, I can pass certain value to the stored procedure, and the stored procedure would give me a value based out of that input parameter. So that's the first type of parameter. And second one is the output parameter. So let's say if you want the stored procedure to return a value to the calling program or the end user, then we make use of output parameter. To specify a parameter as an output parameter, so we have to use the keyword called as output. So once you specify that, the stored procedure treats that as an output parameter. And the last one is the optional parameter. So in case of optional parameters, the SQL server allows you to specify the default value for parameters. So it allows you to skip the parameters that have default values when calling the stored procedures. So I'm going to give you a demo of all these 3 parameters and in the same SSMS stored procedure that we created.
Okay, great.
So at this stage, we see that we just have the name of the stored procedure. So let's say I will just modify the requirement a bit, and I want to get all the interviews that are scheduled on the day of 24th. So to the stored procedure, I would like to give a parameter called as interview date. So to do that, I just say interview date, and I just give that as a date parameter. So once you have that, I just need to insert a where clause. And within the where clause, I just need to say that the interview timestamp is the interview date. So I have a column called as interview timestamp. And at this stage, I'm not interested to know about the time. So I just want the interviews that are scheduled on a particular date. So this is where, I just set this clause in the where statement. So this input parameter, that is interview date, is passed from this stored procedure, and then you have it here as interview date. So I'm just saving this date in here. And so once the stored procedure is created, so now we are making some changes to it, right? So to make changes, so instead of create, I need to say alter. So when I say alter and execute it, the changes that I have just made are updated within the stored procedure. Now, at this stage, if I try to execute the stored procedure, it's going to throw an error because it expects a parameter called as interview date that we are not passing. So I'm going to pass in the date saying this much. So this is the parameter that we need to pass. And now if I execute this, I get the result. So here you can say on the date of 24th, I have 3 interviews scheduled, one with Shane, Kathy, and Sandy. And the interviewer is Jason Roy for all of them. And a couple of them are being interviewed for the position of product owners and one of them for the software developer. So in this, you can specify the standard or the input parameters. So now comes the second parameter called as output. So as I have mentioned, the output parameter is something that gives out a specific value. Okay, so let's say apart from this interview date, I also want to know like what are the total number of interviews scheduled irrespective of the date. I just need a count of the total number of interviews that has been scheduled in the application so far. So I will just say interview counts and I will make it as int. And now you remember, like for output, we always have to reserve a keyword called as output. So I just mentioned the keyword output against the integer. So this shows us that the interviews count is an output variable. Now, the next part is populating the interviews count. So to populate the interviews count, I simply need to write a select statement, which says select interviews count equal to count of the candidate ID from the candidate interview schedule table. So it's a simple query which is just going to return the count of the interviews that has been scheduled within the interview candidate schedule table. So now again, I have made some changes to it. So I have to alter it again for the changes to take effect. So I just do an alter. So now the changes have been effectively executed. I'm just going to remove this, and to make things simple, so now we have to give a call to the stored procedure, right? So to give a call to the stored procedure at this stage, we have 2 parameters. So one is the interview date and second is the interview counts. So for the interview counts, I need to declare a variable. And I have to specify it as ints. And I have to pass that variable over here. And I have to say output. And I will just print the value of the interview counts so that you can actually see what value the interview counts take. I'll just rename it to something sensible, interview count details, interview count details. Yeah. So I will just select all these 3 lines and execute. So here you get the result. That is all the interviews which you did see previously. And if you move on to the messages section, you see the count like 9. So this 9 is the value that I got in the interview count details. So this is the second type of the variable or the parameter. And the third one is the default one. So let's say I also need the interviewer count. So the interviewer count is set to 1. So what does it mean? So basically it means that this SQL stored procedure expects 3 parameters, out of which first 2 are mandatory. And the third one is called as default parameter because you have already supplied a default value of 1 to it. So while calling the stored procedure, if you don't specify this parameter, the stored procedure will still work because it's a default parameter and you have already initialized it with 1. So I will just demonstrate it over here. So let's say I made changes to the stored procedure. I'm just altering it. So the changes have taken effect. Then I go down and I execute this statement. It still gives the same result. The reason being you have declared it as default and you have initialized it to 1. So these are the 3 types of parameters that are usually used within the stored procedure.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, that's a very thorough overview of like different ways that we can get different combinations of inputs and outputs to this stored procedure. All right. Yeah, okay, so you can imagine though with something so complex as possible that an error might be thrown. So how can you do exception handling in a stored procedure?
Yeah, again, that's an interesting question. And that's one of the most powerful mechanism I would say that has to be used by the developers. Irrespective of where you are using the code and how you are using it, you need to have an exception handling or error handling mechanism in place to ensure that you write neat code. And in case something goes wrong, you should be alerted or you should be made aware that something has gone wrong. Yeah. So error handling in SQL, they give us control over the transact SQL code. For example, when things go wrong, we get a chance to do something about it and possibly make it right again. It can be as simple as translating the error in SQL language, because we all know how technical the SQL Server error message could be, and it could make no sense to the end users. So we need to translate these error messages into more meaningful messages and pass on to the users, developers, etc. So basically, we're talking about two types of exceptions in here. One is the unhandled exceptions and one is the business exceptions. So talking about unhandled exceptions, it could be like something has gone wrong unintentionally. So we are trying to insert a null value into a non-null column. So in that case, SQL throws an error. So we need to handle those exceptions gracefully and make sure that system doesn't collapse. And next is the business exceptions. So let's say while inserting a record into a table, you have few business rules. And the record that you're inserting has to follow all those business rules to insert a record into the database. Let's say out of the 12 rules you have in place, one of the rule has failed. So in that case, you want to throw an exception to the end user saying that, something has gone wrong. So this rule has failed. So to do that, you have to throw a business exception to the end user or the calling system. So SQL lets you do that by making use of handling business mechanisms by use of a raise error keyword.
Okay.
That's a high level, description about how do we do exception handling in stored procedures. Now I can talk about like how do we achieve exception handling in stored procedures. So like every other conventional programming language, SQL Server has this basic try catch block. So whatever SQL statements you have, that goes into the try section, and the exception is handled within the catch section. So if something goes wrong, the control gets passed on towards the catch block, and within the catch block, you can handle exception the way you want. For example, in the systems that I have worked previously, so we basically log these errors into a database table. The developers frequently used to scan the error table to see if there are any errors that are being introduced. Whereas some of them would like to send an email trigger to the developers or the database administrators saying that there is something wrong with the stored procedure. There are different ways of alerting the end user or the application developer saying that something has failed. So that can be handled depending upon your requirement within the catch block. That's the first way we do, that is the try catch mechanism. And apart from that, there is a concept called as transaction. So every SQL operation that we do belongs to a transaction. Let's say from the HRMS perspective, the HR is trying to schedule an interview and you want to insert a record into the interview table. Let's say you want to insert another record into the email table. So there are multiple SQL operations happening. And if any one of those SQL operations goes wrong, so we want to roll back the entire transactions, because we don't want a partial transaction to be committed in any table. So either you complete the entire transaction or you roll back the transaction completely. So SQL allows us to do that by making use of a transaction keyword. It says begin transaction, and then we have to end the transaction. And if something goes wrong, we have to roll back the transaction. So how do we get to know if something has gone wrong, right? So SQL has a function called as exact state. And this exact state can take two values, that is 1 or -1. 1 means everything's going well. You need not worry about it anymore. -1 means there is some transaction that has to be rolled back and something has not gone right. So we just check for the value of exact state within the catch block, and then we roll it back. And apart from that, SQL gives you a lot of standard functions called as error number, error state, error severity, error line, error procedure, error message. Using these variables or using these functions, you can get more details about the error. So I will just talk about the two important ones in here, that is the error message. So that's the one that we as a developer usually look out for. Okay, what is the error message saying? Is it giving a message saying it's a null value, or it's a foreign key constraint? So what exactly the error is? So that's the thing we look at, the error message. And next is the error line. So as a developer, you might know, right? We want to know where exactly the error has happened. So the error line will give you the exact line number where the error has happened. So I would like to demonstrate this error handling by sharing my screen again. So yeah, so at this stage we have the basic structure of the SQL created. So like I said, to make exception handling easy, we just say begin try, and at the end we say end try. So this is the try block. Okay, and now we would say begin catch, end catch. So this is the catch block. So all the SQL statements go into the try block, and in the catch block, we deal with the error messages. So how exactly we deal with these error messages, right? So for that, like I mentioned, we have a lot of inbuilt functions. So it could be something very basic like selecting all these parameters. For example, we might want to know what the error number is, what is the severity of this error, and at what line this error is happening, the name of the procedure in which the error has happened, and what is the error message. So we can do something like that to catch these errors and make a note of it. And again, there are, like I mentioned, there are multiple ways to deal with these errors. So in some of the applications that I have worked on, we just save these errors into a database table, whereas some of them just send an email saying that something has gone wrong. And apart from that, I talked about transaction, right? So we can just say, so at this stage, we just have one SQL query select. We don't need to go for a transaction in here, but let's just assume that, we have more insert or update statements within the stored procedure. In that case, I would say begin transaction. So I would just start the SQL blocks by saying this word. And at the end, I would just say end transaction. So let's say I go beyond this, and in the cache mechanism, I can say like, if something goes wrong. So to do that, we have a function called as exact state. So if exact state is not equal to 1, I can roll back the transaction. I will just, yeah. Using these mechanisms, you can handle the errors or exceptions within the stored procedures, and that will make the life of a developer pretty easy. So you can quickly debug the code and you can get the relevant information by using these inbuilt functions.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I think this is a great place to pause. We've learned a lot about stored procedures and SQL Server in general. So thank you for being here with us today. I'd love to debrief a little bit about how you think the interview went. Like, what do you think went really well, and what do you think you would change going forward?
Yeah, so first of all, the questions were, about a bit of theory as well as bit of practical aspect in it. So I believe in few of those areas, I just stretched on the theoretical aspect a bit. So that could have been a good blend of theoretical part as well as the practical part. So as and when I was explaining about these variables, error number, error state, so I could have demonstrated it and as well as explain it parallelly. That was one area which I believe I could have improved on. And yeah, so apart from that, I believe like every key theoretical aspect that I was explaining, I could have related it to a real world example that I have worked on. For example, I have handled or worked in multiple domains. So like every example can be tied up to a real world example, and that makes it a bit more interesting for the listener and for the person who is explaining it as well. So that's something which I believe I kind of missed in this interview session.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, I thought you overall did a really great job of explaining multiple diverse different concepts about stored procedures, though. I particularly liked that when you were explaining the benefits of stored procedures that you covered a wide variety of reasons why you would want to use one, including like cybersecurity performance reasons and just like software engineering, like modularity reasons. And I really like that in general, you explain both like in theory, like the motivation of like why you would want to use it, but also exactly how to. And you covered like a lot of common use cases too. This HR example I thought was a really great like real world application of it. And also error catching, error handling is a very important application as well that most people would need if they were to use stored procedures. So I think we really learned a lot from that. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Sabrish. Yeah, and thank you everybody for watching. Bye everyone.
Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons below to let us know that this video is valuable for you. And of course, check out hundreds more videos just like this at tryexponent.com. Thanks for watching and good luck on your upcoming interview.